Major funding for this series is provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, by public television stations, and by the Chubb Group of insurance companies, for over 100 years providing worldwide business and personal insurance through independent agents and brokers. Additional funding is provided by the George D. Smith Fund, the Christopher Reynolds Foundation, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and other contributors. This program contains scenes of graphic violence. Viewer discretion is advised.
When the United States votes $400 million to help that war, we're not voting for a giveaway program. We're voting for the cheapest way that we can prevent the occurrence of something that would be of the most terrible significance to the United States of America, our security.
If we withdrew from Vietnam, the communists would control Vietnam. Pretty soon, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Malaya would go.
If this little nation goes down the drain and can't maintain her independence, ask yourself what's going to happen to all the other little nations.
If the United States now were to throw in the towel and come home, and the communists took over South Vietnam, then all over Southeast Asia, all over the Pacific, in the Mideast, in Europe, in the world, the United States would suffer a blow. And peace, because we are the great peacekeeping nation in the world today because of our power, would suffer a blow from which it might not recover.
First, a handful of advisors, then the Marines. Finally, an army of 500,000. That was the Vietnam War. It was an undeclared war. A war without front lines or clear objectives. A war against an elusive enemy. A war.
Speak to me.
Yeah, I'm still alive.
Speak to me. What's your name? Tell me what your name is. Where are you from?
Steve, Seattle, Washington.
Seattle, Washington. It's a good town. Good town, good town. Very good
go to
town.
sleep now.
Huh?
Can I go to sleep?
No, don't go to sleep.
We had some precarious situations and we lost some people, but we always won. So to me, we were very successful, you know, but as I think of it now, I don't know what we won. We won a box on a map where the next day we left it and we never came back, maybe.
It was a war that blurred the line between friend and enemy.
Wherever the Americans went, they burned and destroyed and killed. I didn't see any guerrillas being killed, only villagers.
An 8-year-old or a 9-year-old can kill you just as quick as a 25 or a 26-year-old man. Back here in the States, the kids are playing cowboys and Indians. Over there, they've been playing it for real.
It was a war with deep roots, deeper than most Americans knew. Ho Chi Minh and his followers fought for decades against the French, then against the Americans and their South Vietnamese ally.
I always believed in my country. But instead of sending my sons out to defend their country, I sent them out to die.
It was a war that turned South Vietnam inside out. A war that changed the GIs who fought it.
GI, you want Vietnamese cigarette? For a box of Tide, you could get a carton of pre-packed, pre-rolled marijuana cigarettes soaked in opium. For $10, you could get a vial of pure heroin. You could get liquid opium, speed, acid, anything you wanted.
It was the first television war.
What's he got, small arms? Small arms, automatic fire, grenade launcher, and hand grenade.
With uncensored battle reports flashed to the folks at home.
What's the hardest part of it?
Not knowing where they are, that's the worst thing.
You lost any friends?
Quite a few. We lost one the other day. The whole thing stinks, really.
It was the first war Americans opposed in huge numbers, openly and passionately.
Are you listening, Nixon? Oh, we are saying. Are you listening, Agnew?
The Vietnam War ended when the communists took Saigon. The end of the war left questions and issues that are still unanswered and unresolved.
Well, it's time that we recognized ours was in truth a noble cause. Let us tell those who fought in that war that we will never again ask young men to fight and possibly die in a war our government is afraid to let them win.
Vietnam, a noble cause, a shameful venture. The questions continue because for America, the Vietnam War is not over. And it is not over for Vietnam. Not for the hundreds of thousands who have fled the communist regime. Not for the millions who remain in a devastated country that is still at war, in Cambodia and with China. This television series looks back on a hard chapter in America's history and examines the questions now being asked by more and more Americans. How we got there, and what we did there. Two and a half million Americans fought in Vietnam, and 58,000 Americans died there. Why? America's war in Vietnam lasted 15 years. But the Vietnamese have known war a long time, more than 2,000 years. Their traditional enemy was China, their giant neighbor to the north. For centuries, Vietnam was the southernmost part of China's empire. The Vietnamese absorbed Chinese culture and customs, but they never accepted Chinese rule. Today, throughout Vietnam, they commemorate the Trung sisters, who led a rebellion against China in the 1st century after Christ. The rebellion failed, but the Trung sisters are still heroines, part of a long line of Vietnamese who fought foreign domination.
Our history, from the time of the Hung Kings and the Trung sisters to the era of President Ho Chi Minh, has been a history of great struggle. Throughout history, the Vietnamese people have always done their best to defend the country and to build the nation.
They fought for almost 1,000 years after the Trungs to evict the Chinese. Then they pushed south to their present borders, conquering other peoples in their path. The country expanded so rapidly that it fragmented in a series of civil wars. Despite their internal conflicts, the Vietnamese regarded themselves as one country and one people. But they were too weak and divided to fight off the conquering Europeans in the 19th century. Around 1860, the French seized the area near Saigon. They took over central and northern Vietnam during the next 2 decades, and by 1885, Vietnam had once again lost its independence. French Indochina at the end of the 1880s, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, which the French divided into 3 regions, Cochin China, Annam, and Tonkin. To the Vietnamese, the division was a deliberate attempt to destroy their national unity. The first moving images of the new colonies were recorded in the early 1900s. France looked at the traditional Indo-Chinese cultures and saw very little it considered civilization. The colonizers took upon themselves the French version of the white man's burden, la mission civilisatrice, the bringing of civilization and Catholicism to the natives. The Vietnamese resisted. The French called all resistors pirates, and they sent in the troops for the first pacification of Vietnam. They staged public executions. The severed heads were photographed and printed on postcards which soldiers sent home to sweethearts in Paris with kisses from Hanoi. It took 20 years to get the Vietnamese resistance under control. Then the French could concentrate on the economics of colonialism, trying to transform Vietnam into a source of profit. They opened factories and expanded the mines in the north. In the south, they developed tea, rubber, and rice plantations. Indochina exported rice to 30 countries. And exports stayed high even if it meant the peasants starved.
The people here suffered a lot because of high taxes and hard forced labor. They worked from dawn till dusk, but they did not have enough to eat.
The cheap labor profited a few French companies, even though Indochina was a financial sinkhole. The French nation spent millions of francs each year to protect and support the colony, while French companies like Michelin Rubber made millions in profits from factories and plantations. French newsreels showed only clean, modern workplaces, but in fact, the Vietnamese worked under the most brutal and degrading conditions.
In the rubber plantations, the workers were treated so inhumanely that they died young and died in droves. There was a saying that the workers were fertilizer for the rubber trees because their corpses were buried under the trees.
There were no major uprisings during these hard years. Vietnamese society was reeling under the impact of westernization. French culture permeated the cities, bringing Western fashions and ideas. Some French scholars and artists admired Vietnamese civilization, and early Western photographers recorded Vietnamese life. But most French felt superior to the natives. The Vietnamese elite began to give their sons a Western education. Almost all of those who would lead the next resistance to the French were French educated. Among them was Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh's early years are difficult to trace. He was always mysterious about himself, giving few interviews, and preferring in later life to present himself as the benevolent Uncle Ho. Ho was born about 1890 as Nguyen Tat Tan, the son of an official who resigned rather than serve under the French. As a young man, Ho left his country, working as a ship hand and cook in America, Britain, and France. In September 1911, he was in Marseille and sent a request to the Ministry of Colonies. "I would like to be useful to France," he wrote, "in its dealings with my people." And he asked to be admitted to the Colonial Training School. He was told to apply elsewhere. In 1917, Ho moved to Paris. He took the pseudonym Nguyen Ai Quoc, Nguyen the Patriot, and began to agitate for Vietnam's independence. He tried to plead his cause at the Versailles Conference following World War I, but was not admitted. His effort made him famous among the Vietnamese in France. His activities brought him to the attention of the French police. They ran an investigation on this young potential troublemaker and dismissed him with the description, "awkward-looking, mouth constantly open and a stupid smile." In 1920, Nguyen Ai Quoc became a founding member of the French Communist Party, the first Vietnamese communist. He remained in France editing an anti-colonial paper called Le Paria, The Outcast, and supporting himself as a photographer's assistant. His drawings, published in the newspaper, showed he was still concerned with Vietnam, which he had not seen for 10 years. The Communists sent Nguyen Ai Quoc to Moscow for training in 1923. Then, as a communist agent, he went to China. From there, his exact movements become difficult to follow. He traveled widely, organizing expatriate Vietnamese into a revolutionary party. Reports during the next 17 years placed him in Germany, China, Thailand, France, Russia. He was not in Vietnam, but his followers were part of new anti-colonial revolts, competing for popular support with non-communist revolutionaries.
Le 6 février 1930,
on February 6, 1930, the Annamite rebels attacked a military post inIen Bai. And the same day in Hanoi, some rebels attacked police headquarters. They just had a few sardine cans filled with gunpowder and they broke a few windows. I saw the cops in the street and they were all confused, but I said, "This is not that serious."
The French put down the Yen Bai rebellion in 2 days and imprisoned its leaders, who were members of a non-communist party, the VNQ-DD. Most of them were executed in June. But the unrest spread throughout several provinces as the peasants, often led by the small Indo-Chinese Communist Party, demonstrated and seized land. A widespread famine fueled the rebellions.
Un an après, c'est la révolte de Vinh.
A year later, there was a revolt in Vinh. Drought had struck the province of Vinh, and the peasants, who no longer had anything to eat, sent a delegation to the provincial capital. They asked, as this was a tradition that dated back to the time of the emperors, for a waiver of taxes during the drought. The government rejected this demand and got frightened by this large number of peasants on the roads.
But the crowd continued with the march. They marched all the way to Ben Tui. And when the first person climbed up a flagpole at the fork in the road at Ben Tui, the French guards who were on the tower of the Shifa factory shot down at him and killed him. After that, they ordered their soldiers to open fire into the crowd of demonstrators.
Thousands of suspected communists were arrested that year, and nearly 100 party leaders executed. The Indo-Chinese Communist Party was virtually destroyed.
The Communist Party had been founded in 1930, and in 1931, the French stepped up their repression of revolutionaries. They thought that my brother had put up some red banners. They arrested him along with several hundred peasants who had never done anything wrong at all.
We were kept in underground cells with huge iron bars above us. On top of the cells were cement bridges, along which the French guards marched back and forth, so that in case something happened, they could always pour down bullets on us. I was imprisoned with Comrade Fambandong, and when they tortured us, he told them off in French.
The prisons were schools, places where revolutionaries trained themselves.
The French thought the country was pacified. Years earlier, they had settled on a pliable member of the royal family, Kai Din, as emperor, to put the stamp of legitimacy on their decisions. His son, Bao Dai, was sent to France for his education. Bao Dai spent 10 years away, acquiring a taste for French wine and a reputation as a playboy. After Kai Din's death, the young Emperor Bao Dai performed as instructed, attending Paris receptions, listening to French platitudes, and doing little to help his people during the years of the worst colonial repression. France was proud of its colonial record.
Pâté Journal croit nécessaire de présenter ce rapide inventaire de l'œuvre accomplie jusqu'à ce jour à l'abri de nos couleurs. Dans de nombreuses régions, autrefois désertiques, où des tribus hostiles les unes aux autres traînaient une existence misérable, les civilisateurs français ont apporté la paix, le travail, la prospérité, la joie. La France admet comme légitime et heureuse la diversité des civilisations qu'elle respecte. Tout Français est citoyen d'une France mondiale de 100 millions d'habitants. Par son importance et sa fécondité, le domaine français d'outre-mer est devenu un élément essentiel de la vie économique mondiale, une force active de la civilisation, un glorieux témoignage de la grandeur de la France.
1940 brought the end of this grandeur of France. Japan, pursuing its conquest of China, wanted to block the transport of war materiel through Vietnam. In June 1940, 3 days after France fell to Nazi Germany, Japan demanded the right to land forces in Indochina. Unable to get instructions from Paris, the French governor made his own decision.
He thought that to concede a certain number of rights within very specific conditions, while maintaining the principle and form of French sovereignty over Indochina, was the wisest and most appropriate solution in that situation. And indeed, there could be only two solutions. to fight and resist, or to try maintaining the essentials of French sovereignty over Indochina, while sacrificing only a few rights to the Japanese.
Under the agreement, Japanese troops would use French Indochina's air bases and facilities. Japan let the French bureaucracy continue to manage civil administration, freeing the Japanese to prepare for further conquest. French Indochina's roads, harbors, and railways became crucial to Japan's war machine, as did its rice, rubber, and coal. To the French, the Japanese presence brought few changes. They were the only Europeans that the conquering Japanese left free throughout the war. Japan's arrival deeply impressed the Vietnamese. Asians like themselves had overthrown the European colonials, for it was clear who was in charge. And to the United States, Japan's actions looked increasingly ominous. President Roosevelt pressured Japan by cutting supplies of scrap metal and imposing an oil embargo. In negotiations at the end of November 1941, the United States proposed that Japan withdraw from Indochina entirely. 10 days later, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The Japanese swept down through southern Asia, conquering British and Dutch and American territories. French Indochina was a small part of a world war.
Indochina and even the other countries of Southeast Asia were really relatively small potatoes, particularly in connection with the war. I became chief of the Division of Southeast Asian Affairs in the State Department on July 1st, 1944, during the war. There were no activities at the moment that we as a department had to do, but we were concerned to find that I was concerned to learn that the president had already decided that Indochina should be on international trusteeship after the war. He apparently had told a great many people this, that he did not want the French to go back, that they'd been there over 100 years, and the people of Indochina were worse off now than they were then.
Roosevelt said different things to different Allied leaders. The Allies met repeatedly during the war and made declarations about the rights of oppressed peoples to choose their own governments. But they never said how this would be done. Roosevelt was reluctant to offend Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and the British were opposed to dismantling the French Empire. Churchill saw it as the first step to the end of the British Empire. And General de Gaulle, head of the Free French Forces, made it clear that to him, Indochina was still French.
Et culturelle de l'Union indo-chinoise. Elle est et elle restera sa propre mandataire.
Roosevelt avoided a decision. At various times, he talked about international trusteeship or Chinese or even French trusteeship.
Well, of course, that really meant that he'd abandoned his position. But I think a great deal of that was because of one, the pressure of the other countries who did not want to have trusteeship for their own territories. They were willing to have trusteeship for any territories of the enemy, but not their own.
In early 1945, the collaboration between the Japanese and the French in Indochina ended. The war was going badly for the Japanese. A small French resistance movement had begun in Vietnam, and Allied bombing around Saigon further alarmed the Japanese.
General de Gaulle était extrêmement clair.
General de Gaulle was extremely clear. General de Gaulle thought that France could only return to Indochina with arms in hand, and that implied fighting the Japanese.
Et les Japonais ont devancé
The Japanese anticipated the fight
en faisant le coup
with the coup of March 9,
mars
1945.
1945.
On that day, the Japanese overthrew the French. With brilliant coordination, they imprisoned all French troops except for a few that were out on maneuvers. After months of hardship, the survivors reached China. French rule, saved at the expense of French pride in 1940, was destroyed. To legitimize the coup, the Japanese ambassador made an offer to Emperor Bao Dai, who had spent the war years in Hue.
He said to me, "Yesterday, we terminated French sovereignty. And today, Japan is happy to bring you your independence." We weighed the pros and the cons. What was this independence worth? How should we take it? The ministers told me, "Your Majesty cannot refuse this independence, for independence has been a forbidden word for a century."
The Japanese supported several Vietnamese nationalist groups, but other groups were both anti-French and anti-Japanese. The most important was the Viet Minh, founded in 1941 by Nguyen Ai Quoc. He had returned to Vietnam after 30 years with a new name, Ho Chi Minh, meaning he who enlightens.
After the conference to establish the Viet Minh, Uncle Ho sent out a letter calling for the support of the population. And it was this that rallied the entire country around the movement. And when people realized that Ho Chi Minh was actually Nguyen Ai Quoc, their trust in the movement was further established. This was because the name Nguyen Ai Quoc had been widely known in the country. People knew that he was a great patriot.
Like Ho, many Viet Minh leaders were veterans of the old Indo-Chinese Communist Party. But the Viet Minh during the war was nationalist, not communist in program. It organized guerrilla bases, trained cadres, harassed the French and Japanese, and spread propaganda, urging the peasants to resist.
Why did the Viet Minh fight the Japanese while other Asian nationalists collaborated?
I apologize, but this is a very funny question. At that time, the Japanese had already overthrown the French and begun to dominate our country. So of course we had to fight the Japanese.
By early 1945, Vietnam was suffering a terrible famine. People blamed the French and Japanese, who were hoarding rice, feeding it to Japanese troops, and even exporting it to Japan, while an estimated 2 million Vietnamese out of 8 million in the northern areas died.
How come we suffered in 1945? Because of the arrival of the Japanese. The French were already exploiting us, and now on top of the French, the Japanese were exploiting us.
This is bitterly ironic, because since March 9th, our administration had really stopped working, and especially in getting rice supplies to northern Tonkin. The rice supply was never sufficient, and as we waited for the harvest, food would come on huge junks from Saigon along the coast. And it was, of course, the French administration that set up this supply, whereas the Japanese could not care less. It was not their business.
So many people died of hunger here in this village. I myself had to bury 4 people, and we did not have enough wood to make coffins for them. I had to wrap the 4 corpses I buried with hemp cloth. I buried 4 people in that graveyard over there. In this village, more than 250 people died of hunger. I witnessed families in which every member died.
Lên đến Hà Nội lúc bấy giờ đó, chúng tôi tính giờ là vào khoảng độ.
At that time, in our estimate, at least 40,000 starving, poor peasants arrived in Hanoi
Lên đến Hà Nội để đi xin ăn,
to beg for food
để
and to wait for handouts, for alms.
bố thí cho. Pháp thì nó không tổ chức
The French did not organize any hunger relief,
tổ chức cứu đói cho nhân dân.
and the Japanese specifically forbade us to carry out any hunger relief effort of our own.
Là ở các phố thì bà con là bới những các cái đống
People
rác
dug into the
để
garbage
tìm
dumps
tất
in order
cả
to
cái
find
gì có
any
thể ăn
edible
được.
thing at all.
Rồi sau đó đến
They also ate rats,
nghĩa là bắt chuột mà ăn, nhưng mà cũng
but this
không
was not enough to keep them alive.
sống được. Chúng tôi buổi sáng ra ở những phố đông người, mở cửa ra nhà.
Every morning when we opened our door, we saw 5 to 7 corpses of people who had died the night before.
Nằm chết cóng lúc ban đêm.
The Viet Minh organized the peasants to seize rice stocks and gain tremendous prestige. This peasant support gave them a political edge they never lost.
It's a long, tough road to Tokyo. It's longer to go to Tokyo than it is to Berlin, in every sense of the word. The defeat of Germany will not mean the end of the war against Japan.
As the war in Europe drew to a close, Allied attention turned to Asia and the war against Japan. One of the pressing needs was intelligence.
As essential as the defeat of Germany.
The Viet Minh believed Allied statements supporting the rights of oppressed peoples. They had given the Allies information about Japanese troop movements. So the Americans turned to the Viet Minh and its leader, Ho Chi Minh.
Well, Ho Chi Minh was the name that we ran into occasionally as one of the nationalist leaders among the Vietnamese, leader of a communist group, but we have no idea whether he carried any weight or anything about him until our OSS was actively in the field. And when Ho Chi Minh began his very helpful operation of rescuing downed flyers who'd fallen in the jungle.
I first met Ho on the China border between China and Indochina in the last days of April of 1945. He was quite an interesting individual, very sensitive, very gentle, a rather frail type. We spoke quite at length about the general situation, not only in Indochina, but the world at large.
We knew he was a communist, but we also felt, as they did, and the way anybody who has met Ho Chi Minh that I've ever talked with had the same feeling, he was first a nationalist and second a communist. That is, he was interested in getting the independence of his people, and then he thought probably the best thing for them was the communist type of government. But he was a nationalist first and foremost.
The Viet Minh agreed to help the Allies. Major Patty sent a training group, the Deer Mission, into the northern mountains.
The Deer team went in and they organized out of about 500 Vietnamese. We selected, with the help of General Giap, selected 200. We spent the next 4 weeks training these young men into the art of using automatic weapons, demolition equipment, and the infiltrating and exfiltrating into various dangerous areas. There, for the first time, we saw what kind of troops the Viet Minh were. They were very willing, fine, young nationalists, really what we used to say gung-ho type. They were willing to risk their lives for their cause, the cause of independence against the French.
Before Ho's men could prove their willingness, World War II was over. The sudden Japanese collapse took many in French Indochina by surprise, but the Viet Minh were ready for what they called the August Revolution. Declaring Vietnam independent, they marched in to take Hanoi peacefully. Ho Chi Minh formed a government in Hanoi, carefully mixing in members of other nationalist groups. But in the South, away from Ho's moderating influence, his followers started purging rival nationalists.
In reality, I did not know this government in Hanoi. But one day, I received a telegram from all levels of the population asking me to make a historic gesture, that is, to resign. These people believed that if I were to stay on the throne, the Allies would not trust me. They believed that the government of Ho Chi Minh had the support of the Americans.
The emperor resigned. Still with the Viet Minh, and perhaps reinforcing the idea of American support, was the OSS.
2 or 3 days after I met Ho, he asked me to come in and stop in and see him, at which time he wanted to show me something. And what he wanted to show me was a draft of the Declaration of Independence that he was going to declare several days later. Of course, it was in Vietnamese and I couldn't read it, and when it was interpreted to me, I was quite taken aback to hear the words of the American Declaration of Independence. Words about liberty and life and the pursuit of happiness, etc. I just couldn't believe my own ears.
On September 2nd, 1945, on board the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan formally surrendered. And on the same day throughout Vietnam, the Vietnamese celebrated their self-proclaimed Independence Day and the formation of a new country, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. In Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh read a speech that began, "All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights."
Vì vậy đó, đến khi mà Hồ Chủ tịch lên lễ đài đó,
I can say that the most moving moment was when President Ho Chi Minh climbed the steps and the national anthem was sung. It was the first time that the national anthem of Vietnam was sung in an official ceremony. Uncle Ho then read the Declaration of Independence, which was a short document. As he was reading, Uncle Ho stopped and asked, "Compatriots, can you hear me?" This simple question went into the hearts of everyone there. After a moment of silence, they all shouted, "Yes, we hear you." And I can say that we did not just shout with our mouths, but with all our hearts. The hearts of over 400,000 people standing in the square then. After Uncle Ho finished reading the Declaration of Independence, an airplane, a small one, circled over us. We did not know whose plane it was. We thought that it was a Vietnamese plane. But when it swooped down over us, we recognized the American flag. The crowd cheered enthusiastically.
Ho Chi Minh was on a silver platter in 1945. We had him. He was leaning not towards the Soviet Union, which at the time he told me that the USSR could not assist him because they had just won a war only by dint of real heroism, and they were in no position to help anyone. So really, we had Ho Chi Minh, we had the Viet Minh, we had the Indochina question in our hand.
Few American officials shared Major Patty's assessment. Ho appealed to President Harry Truman, but he would probably have accepted anyone's support. Truman did not respond to Ho's letters. He had been in office only 4 months in August 1945 and had not had time to formulate a policy on Indochina.
There was quite a division in the State Department over Indochina. Both the Far Eastern Office and the European Office were in complete agreement that we wanted a strong France recovered in Europe from the trauma of Vichy and the defeat in the war. And but the European division felt to help get the French back on their feet, we should go along with practically anything that the French wanted. We in Southeast Asia Division and the Far Eastern Office, on the other hand, were very conscious of the tremendous surge of nationalism that had was taking place, had already started before the war, and now had been thrust forward at accelerated speed during the war. And the result was the department had no official policy towards Indochina.
The Allies had worked out a compromise plan to disarm the Japanese. Above the 16th parallel, the Chinese would take the surrender of Japanese troops. The British would do the same in the south. They arrived in Saigon in early September.
We had come out of Burma, and it was literally like going into a beautiful slice of Paris. It was a wonderful experience after what we had been through, and I think that we had not been warned that there was a political situation, or potential political situation on our hands, and we were driven into Saigon, and there were banners out saying, "Welcome to the Allied Commission," in English. The situation was apparently completely peaceful. Then the local people, who we came to know as the Annamites, started digging up the road at night. You'd be driving along and suddenly a tree would drop in front of you. And it moved on from there to a situation where there was a lot of incendiarism at night, and we were rushing troops from one point to another, becoming a more difficult situation.
The British commander, General Douglas Gracie, was a seasoned colonial officer with limited political experience. His orders were to disarm the Japanese and maintain law and order. His staff officers included Brigadier D.E. Taunton.
It was a very difficult period for me at that time. The Japanese were in control and were armed. The French were imprisoned by the Japanese, and my job was to release them, and the Annamites appeared to be in control of government buildings and so on and so forth. So I went through a very difficult period of trying to rearm the French, trying to disarm the Annamites, and not bothering very much about the Japanese, who were well behaved, and I left them with their small arms for a while.
He did everything possible to destroy our administration in order to reinstall a pro-French administration. To do this, he intentionally went against Allied orders to disarm the 100,000 Japanese troops. Instead of disarming them, he disarmed us, the revolutionary forces of Vietnam. He used the Japanese troops and rearmed the French Legionnaire regiments to fight against the Vietnamese Revolution.
And everything got a bit out of hand. And the only logical thing to do was to rearm the Japanese, who were highly trained, they had surrendered, and they were at that time reliable. It was a bit odd to do it, I admit that, but it worked.
How did you feel? Did you approve?
I personally thought it was the right thing to do, because I had been dealing with the Japanese quite a lot, answering their problems about terms of surrender and so on and so forth. And I felt it was far better, and I felt happier, to have rearmed Japanese in control of the key points, rather than trigger-happy and untrained Frenchmen, as some of them were, running about and offering themselves as targets to the Annamites, and the Annamites taking full advantage of it.
We did everything possible to accommodate Gracie. He came here with only 2 battalions of Indian troops. It was not a formidable force, but we still did our best to help him. We turned over our headquarters to him, and we enabled his troops to move about freely. Then he forbade us to move around and imposed a curfew. But Gracie's troops and the Japanese soldiers could move around, and he took advantage of this to mount a sneak attack on us on September 23rd.
The orders, as I remember them, were on the 23rd, the French would take over certain key points quickly, quietly, from the Annamites, assisted by my troops when necessary. My troops would also take over the bank and the post office, and all this would be achieved quietly in the night. It went perfectly quietly and all right, but it broke down as the day went on the following day, that the French, as I said earlier, became overexcited and all sorts of shooting and noise was going on.
The day after the coup, French troops released from months of Japanese captivity went on a rampage, arresting and attacking Vietnamese. Despite the violence, General Gracie and his men had no doubts that legitimate government had returned to Saigon.
He had absolutely no mandate whatever to start talking about handing over French Indochina to anybody other than the French. He had his strict instructions.
I never lost the impression that in due course the French would have to take over control and responsibility when they were in a position and strong enough to do so. I never entered my head that I was going to hand back control to Annamites.
It was an obvious move that they were going to restore the French to power in Indochina. I think our European division probably silently applauded. We silently gnashed our teeth, and but there was nothing that we could do about it. This was a theater which we really only had nominal participation in, and so we just had to watch.
America's watching was being done by OSS men. One of them, Lieutenant Colonel Peter Dewey, especially annoyed the French representative, Colonel Cédille, and General Gracie.
When Gracie and the French representative found out that we were meeting with Dewey, they were extremely angry. And although they did not say it publicly, they showed that they were clearly against the activities of Dewey.
Colonel Dewey of the OSS was a law to himself. He had arrived and attached himself to the Control Commission, I think a little to Cédille's surprise as well as Gracie's surprise, and he was a man who acted always on his own.
Relations between the OSS men and General Gracie deteriorated. After a dispute over who had the rank to fly a flag on his car, Gracie suggested, or ordered, it's not clear which, that Peter Dewey leave Saigon. On September 26th, Colonel Dewey set out with his friend Captain Blueshell in a less than clearly marked Jeep.
As we were driving along, we came to a corner. We had to turn to the right, and about 10 yards further down, as we turned, we encountered a roadblock consisting of some logs and a little brush. Nothing formidable, but it necessitated for us to make a reverse S to get through. This was alongside the golf course.
Saigon Golf Course. So as we're going through the S part of the roadblock, we saw 3 enemies in the ditch to our left. So Peter shook his fist at him and yelled something in French. Now, what he said, I don't know because I don't speak French or understand it. At that point, a machine gun opened fire. And the burst hit Peter Dewey right in the head, back of the head. It looked like part of his lower jaw had been shot away, and the Jeep continued then towards the ditch and rolled over on its side. Firing continued, but the chassis of the Jeep protected me. The machine gun burst didn't touch me. Just lucky. I don't know why it didn't.
We tried our best to find out what happened, but there was nothing we could do, and it was a question as to whether there was anything we should try to do, because I say that was a case of a murder rather than a military action.
Turns out that Peter Dewey was the first American to be killed in Vietnam.
In France's Vietnam War, the French generals expected to win in 8 days. After 8 years, $2.5 billion in American aid, and a devastating defeat at Dien Bien Phu, the war was finally over, and France had lost. The First Vietnam War, next on Vietnam.
This program was produced by WGBH Boston, which is solely responsible for its content. Major funding for this series was provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities.